So if you don't know Ryan Gibson, he is the Libero Professor of Regional Economic Development at the University of Guelph in the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development. Ryan teaches rural and community economic development to graduate students. And he comes by this work honestly. He grew up in rural southern Manitoba, and he's active on these issues, not just at work, but he's also the past president of the Canadian Community Economic Development Network and the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, and brings a lot to bear to this conversation. So it's my pleasure to pass it over to you.
Perfect. I just have to remember which remote does which computer on all of that. So, but thank you for that lovely introduction this morning. It's really exciting to see everybody in the room and everybody that's online. First off, I think this is one of the first times I've actually been able to do in-person discussions, which is lovely, but also wonderful. As everyone knows, rural is defined by distance as well. So being able to bridge people in that are not able to be physically here in Edmonton is fantastic. I'm really excited about the conversation, and just through the introductions that people had a moment ago, kind of their word to connect themselves to rural, I thought was really interesting, and really excited to explore these different themes over the coming day in these discussions. But over the next 30 minutes or so, I wanted to really kind of do four things on our journey together. One is to give you a sense of who I am, the perspectives that I'm bringing to this conversation, so that you get a better sense of where my commentary is coming from. Wanted to just highlight a few of the impacts that are, a few of the transitions that are taking place in rural communities that are influencing almost all of the decisions that are taking place today. And then I wanted to explore some communities that have been navigating these transitions, not to share them with you from the perspective that they're the silver bullet of what to do, but rather they're innovative experiences that might serve as a catalyst for how we might transfer these sorts of ideas to other places, or how we might be inspired by other communities and what they're doing as we think about how we collectively move forward. And at the end, just wanted to pass along a few notes around my thoughts around what we can do to move forward. So close. Would you be able just to advance that slide for me? We thought we got all the technology out of the system, but we did not. Excellent, thank you. So as was mentioned, I grew up in a really small town in southern Manitoba, and by small, I mean very small. I grew up in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Cree on Treaty 1 lands, and in the community of Homefield, which you can see this lovely photo from a number of years ago. I'm delighted to say that the photo is much older than I am. But I was looking through the history books recently that my grandparents passed along, and there was a description from 1882 of my hometown. And it reads, Homefield consists of one log house and a stable, which in the distance might easily be mistaken for a snowbank. The natural advantage claimed by locals of the location are really to be found actually 2 miles up the creek, where there is the slight potential for low-level bridging practices. So in 1882, the description of my hometown was essentially, if you blinked, you would miss it, or a snowbank could be disguised for the community. This was my initial connection to rural, growing up in southern Manitoba. I am a rural geographer by training. I'm a professor at the University of Guelph today. It was not a linear process from Homefield, Manitoba to the University of Guelph on that front. Oh, technology works. No, someone else has got the technology. So growing up at Homefield, I witnessed the outmigration of young people, the consolidation of farms, the high interest rates, the disappearance of family farms, the disappearance of the pro rate for grain shipping, decreased public service provision. All of these things took place as I was growing up in rural communities. And this video that's showing here is from the National Film Board, and it always has reminded me of the realities faced by rural communities, the moving of the grain elevator, physically, but also metaphorically, out of these places, really changes the dynamic. And although many of these have been often construed as negatives for the future of these communities, What's really interesting for myself and something I didn't discover until I left rural was that rural didn't just roll over and done. When all of these transitions were taking place, rural didn't just simply pack up their bags and say, we're done, we're out, but rather they've continued to operate. They've continued to innovate. They've continued to roll with the proverbial punches that the economy, that the larger society that has been playing out in their spaces. And so that for me has been kind of the interesting piece that's been guiding my own career around rural communities. So as was mentioned by Susanna, just to give you a sense of what is a Libro professorship, because it's not something that you probably have come across before, this is a really unique arrangement between the University of Guelph and rural communities of Southwestern Ontario. They came together and to create a $1 million endowment that was made possible by a credit union that serves many of the rural region, as well as 2 farm families. And they created this professorship to advance rural and regional economic development in the region. And they had an incredible insight when they did it. It wasn't just to work within the region, but also to work outside of this region, because there's other ideas from other places like here in Alberta that could migrate back into that region to influence their futures. So we have a team of approximately 25 graduate students and postdoctoral fellows working on a wide variety of topics that you can see here on the screen, whether it's rural economic development, immigration, place-based development, the evaluation of public policy to answer that beautiful question of, is the policy effective? Is it delivering good initiatives to the communities that it's supposed to be advancing? And how do we know when we've got good policy or perhaps policy that doesn't do what we were hoping it to do? So as a horrible joke, I've put up a lovely website at the bottom of the screen, but I was notified yesterday that the website is actually down for some maintenance. So I encourage you to write it down, bookmark it, and come back midweek when you return from the weekend and recharge, you're reviewing your notes. It should be back up and running. It has a whole series of resources there, but at the moment you'll probably get some lovely error message if you try to navigate there today. So my apologies. So there we go. As we were chatting this morning with our introductions, this notion of transitions emerged at almost most people's comments, which was really interesting. We all either recognize these transitions, we've experienced them firsthand, we might hold optimism about the transitions, or we might actually hold concerns about how these transitions are going to impact the future. And it could very well be a combination of all of these things at the end of the day. We could spend hours, days talking about these transitions, what they look like, how we might combat them, how we might harness them. But I wanted to just highlight a few that I think would be important for our conversation. And before I identify them, it's also important to remember that some of these transitions are internal to our communities and we have control over them. And some of them are external, that we are part of a much larger system and we're navigating kind of our own space within that. So here are the 8 that I wanted to highlight this morning. And they're in no particular order on that front, but these 8 are transitions that are impacting a lot of the activities that are taking place, whether you're in a metro adjacent community outside of Edmonton, or whether you are in northeastern Alberta. So the first is around technology advancements. And over the last 20 years and continuing, particularly the last 5 years in the pandemic, we've seen all sorts of new technological developments that are changing how rural communities operate and how businesses that operate in rural spaces are done. Whether this is around digitization, automation, artificial intelligence, it's having a huge impact, particularly for rural businesses. So as we start to think about this, we can envision examples where extractive industries that were incredibly labor intensive are now actually employing new technologies that decrease that need for labor. It's advancing the business and perhaps the profitability, but for rural communities, it's often decreasing employment opportunities for that region. So all sorts of technologies are impacting rural economies. We can also look to urbanization from 2 perspectives. One, I think, is the most common, which is related to people moving from rural and northern communities into urban areas. And this is not a new transition by any stretch of the imagination. Rural Canada's population has not been larger than urban Canada since 1941. We know that about 17% of Canadians live in rural and small towns. So we know that people are moving out, and they're moving out for a variety of reasons, whether it's education opportunities, employment opportunities, access to health and social services, even amenity-based decision-making. The other part of urbanization as a trend that I think is perhaps more important to think about is around power. And the transition of power and policy has incredibly been urban dominated over the last 15 years. And sometimes it makes sense. The industries are the focus of that policy is an urban phenomenon, but often a lot of the decision making is being done with a cookie cutter like approach that maybe works in urban settings. But as we start to migrate out from urban areas, the ability for that policy, that program to work well for small towns starts to fall apart. I think another key transition that's happening is around partnerships. We have a culture of through electoral systems, through community competition. I used to always say that hockey was one of the greatest barriers to collaboration in southern Manitoba because we always are wanting to defend the interests of our community. And so this starts to impact how do we partner with neighboring communities that might have similar priorities, similar challenges as we start to move forward. And this is complicated, particularly by the last transition that I've noted up here, which is this notion of project versus process funding. And we've almost exclusively moved in Canada to project funding models, where we fund a particular activity to get it done, with the assumption that communities have the capacity to build the necessary partnerships to manage the project, but we've moved away from process funding, where we're investing in organizations, we invest in relationships, we invest in the process of working together. We're almost transitioned exclusively to project-based funding. And this has ramifications for rural and small communities when we think about the existing capacity that's there, volunteer burnout that might be taking place, but also as we encourage more partnerships to take place, these don't happen without an investment of time, investment of energy, and an investment of real financial capital at the end of the day. As I continue to bounce around the screen, the next one I'll mention is this metaphor that rural Canada has become the ATM machine for urban Canada. Rural Canada is where natural resources are coming from: food, minerals, timber. Most of those natural resources don't stay in rural. They go to urban areas where they're processed, where they're exported, where they're put into the economy, and they often, the return on those resources is largely benefiting urban communities. And so for many years, colleagues of mine have made this argument that rural has kind of become the ATM machine metaphor for urban Canada, pulling out resources, but rarely making deposits. Urban Canada is using rural for water sources, they're using it for recreation and amenities and holidays, but the investment from urban Canada into rural is very limited. It tends to be more one-directional, going from rural into urban areas. And that's something that is, we don't have an explicit program of this, but as we start to look at how things operate, we start to see this power imbalance, the asymmetries that are in these relationships. The next one I would say, which is really exciting, is the empowerment of Indigenous communities that is taking place over the last 25 years. And this has been tremendous. Many Indigenous communities and nations are having really innovative, exciting economic development, community development activities taking place. And one of the things that often gets missed is that the priorities of Indigenous communities often have a strong overlap with the priorities of rural and northern communities. But we often view them as being very separate. And we process them, we pursue them through various channels, but we don't see a lot of collaboration taking place. We're missing a huge potential that's there. The second transition I'll mention is downloading. This is probably not new to anybody in the room, but as senior levels of government, whether that be in Ottawa or here in Edmonton at the legislature, are increasingly pushing responsibilities down to local communities. And the ability for local communities to respond to that is getting more and more challenging, often because most local communities and rural communities have limited financial options to raise revenue or to find other mechanisms to support new responsibilities that they've been inheriting. And the last one I'll mention is we have an increase, which is exciting, with place-based approaches to development, where we're, rather than looking at things from a very high level or a macro level, it's like, what is in this community or this region? What are their assets? And what are those assets that the community would like to collectively mobilize in terms of development, in terms of their future? How do they use them? And that's really exciting to see, moving away from maybe economic strategies and moving more to economic sector-based strategies and moving to more holistic place-based strategies. But this is also incredibly challenging to do because it means if you have 100 communities in rural Alberta, you may have 100 rural strategies that are place-based. So again, it goes back to this notion of project funding and process funding that we've largely abandoned. So some of these transitions, you might think of them as a bit of a storm that are impacting rural communities, but there's lots of silver linings. The silver lining, I think, is perhaps larger than the gray part of the cloud. We see growth in many communities across rural Canada. Exciting is that rural communities have been welcoming newcomers and new immigrants like before. We also see that the gross domestic product, the values of all the goods and services produced in rural, is roughly about the same as the percent of Canadians living in rural, which you don't often see in the national media, that rural is pulling its weight economically. And we also see some really cool innovations that are taking place in economic development across rural Canada. I think another piece that's really important to recognize is that as we are entertaining these transitions, we often get caught up in thinking that perhaps the sky is falling or it's a bit overwhelming, which are natural reactions. But as the pandemic started, we saw lots of governments at various levels saying, what can we do to support rural? Almost as if we'd never seen this before. But rural communities have seen many downturns, many transitions. This is not new. And so colleagues and myself worked on a wonderful report that's available online that came up with 4 really important messages to senior levels of government as we're thinking about rural communities and transitions. The first is that communities will experience the transition differently. No 2 communities may experience it the same, and as a result, we need flexibility in our approaches to build on those local assets and the local strengths. We also recognize that industry support doesn't always translate to community support. Supporting a particular industry or particular types of businesses might benefit the business, but there may not be a direct correlation to benefiting the community. And that's largely a byproduct of many of the companies that are operating. Most of their head offices are not located in rural areas today. And so where the benefits actually lie is something we need to be very mindful of. We can also think of this dilemma of shovel-ready projects might dig bigger holes. And for the last couple of economic downturns, we've had a huge push by federal and provincial governments to turn to shovel-ready projects, things that you can do in the next 30 to 90 days to move forward. And these are good projects, but often the key priorities for the future of our rural communities are not things that can be bundled into a 1-year project that you can kickstart in 30 days. So as a result, we start to invest in projects and activities that are good, but they're not the cornerstone of the future of rural communities. And that can be a challenge. And we also know that local governments are going to struggle maintaining critical infrastructure services at the end of the day during these downturns. So we need to figure out how we can support them to do that. I was traveling in rural Ireland a few years ago, and someone asked me, we all had to go through our phones as an icebreaker to find a metaphor for rural development based on just a photo that was in your phone, which was an interesting challenge. And I was delighted to find this photo because this is what often seems like it's happening. Rural communities are that person trying to get across the street, and the future, whether it is an economic restructuring, whether it is loss of employment, whether it's climate change, feels like that oncoming car. And that's really a challenging environment to operate in. So I wanted to take the next few moments to share some examples from across Canada of communities that are navigating some of these challenges that we've got on the go. So the first opportunity that I think is really exciting is this notion of embedding wealth in place. We often think of rural communities as being financially less affluent than urban areas. But we often don't understand how to calculate wealth in rural communities. It's calculated differently. It's more integrated into land values, production. There's so many other factors. So we should start asking ourselves the question of how do we capture the existing wealth that's in our communities before it disappears? Because there's a huge amount of wealth that's there. And we've been working on 2 different strategies to do this. One is related to charities and nonprofit organizations. And there are about 65,000 charities in Canada, 18,000 of which are located in small towns. Here in Alberta, you can see that the light green is those communities that are under 10,000, and the red color are communities that are between 10,000 and 100,000. So approximately 1/3 of all the charities in Alberta are rural based. So one of the questions that we've been asking is, how do communities collect the wealth that's there before it disappears? I think of my family as a prime example. I live in a small town. My sister lives in Calgary. I live in Ontario. When my parents pass away, in all likelihood, unless my mother writes me out of the will, I'm going to get 50%. My sister will get 50%. The community where they raise their entire wealth will see none of it. It'll all leave upon their death in all likelihood. So how do we find some interesting ways to collect that wealth before it leaves? And there are about 94 communities across Canada that have created community-based endowment funds. These are charities that collect funds. They invest the funds for long term. The interest generated on the fund gets reinvested into the community based on community priorities. In small towns in Canada, these range anywhere from about $500,000 invested up to $10 million invested. They do incredible work. They come under a variety of names. It might be a trust, it might be a community foundation, it could be a benevolent society. But these are vehicles to capture wealth, to keep it in place, and then to redistribute it outwards to local priorities without needing the permission of Edmonton or Ottawa around what you decide to fund. So an interesting strategy. We can also look to another strategy called community investment funds. And these are provincially designed programs that try to encourage investment in your community as opposed to sending your investment outwards into the global market. So businesses often lack access to financial capital in rural communities, whether it's for new business creation or business expansion. And so there's an opportunity in 6 provinces in the country that you can create a community investment fund that would collect money locally and invest it locally in economic development opportunities. So these are the 6 that are available. Nova Scotia was the first in 1999. If you invest $1,000, let's take New Brunswick as an example, the province would give you a 50% tax rebate for your investment. So if you invest $1,000, if you keep your money in for 4 years, you will receive a $500 return on your investment. I'm not sure if you can find that sort of a return on investment in the market today. In addition to that, if your investment creates a dividend, you would also receive the dividend from your investment. So these are programs that are being offered. I will suggest, if you look 4 down on the sheet, you'll see the province of Alberta. This was created in 2018. However, the program was canceled in 2019. And so it is no longer available here in Alberta. But we do have examples, these are some from across the country, where they have collected funds collectively, put them into a bank account, collected them, gone through the Securities Commission, invested their money into economic development activities to pursue small business loans, expansion in the local or the region itself. So FarmWorks is helping farms, particularly looking at energy transitions, looking at expansion of farms. The Just Works, or Just Us is a coffee roaster, beans, employment opportunities. They're doing really cool things. This is a way that most people that live in rural communities have retirement investment savings. In all of these provinces, you can actually ask your bank to invest in a community investment fund in your community, so the money stays in your community as part of your portfolio. You don't have to invest new money. This could just be reprofiling existing wealth that you have. And most of us, by no default of our own, have no idea where our money actually is geographically invested. We send it to the bank and financial institution do good things, they give us money back, hopefully it returns. But whether it supports your local main street or whether it's supporting downtown Toronto or Vancouver is difficult. This is an opportunity to actually use your existing portfolio to support that. We also can look at infrastructure and rural economic development. And we've been working with communities across Ontario. And one of the things that we have noticed is how prepared are communities for economic, demographic change, climate change. So we, rather than talking about anecdotes, we surveyed all 440 municipalities in the province to find out where they were at. And if you can see it on the far left-hand side is the I'm not prepared statements. On the right-hand side is the I am prepared statements. And when we look to economic change on the top line, we end up with 6% of local governments saying they're prepared for economic changes. transitions, which meant that they have a plan in place and they're starting to implement it. 6%. When we look to demographic change, about 6% communities thought they had a good plan in place. When we look to climate change and technology, it drops to 2.5%. This is elected leaders and staff saying 6% are prepared for economic change. This means 90-some% are somehow not as prepared. And what's interesting is that when we look at just simply economic change, 55% of all the communities surveyed said they are either unprepared or unsure how to do this. They recognize that there are changes happening, but they don't know where to start. Over half of the communities in Ontario. My suspicion is this is not unique to Ontario by any stretch of the imagination. This pattern is probably playing out in other communities as well across the country. We also were curious about partnerships. I mentioned it earlier on. And so we asked local governments about economic development and infrastructure, whether they partner with other municipalities, as well as First Nation and Indigenous communities. We see in terms of economic development, about 12% are partnering actively with a neighboring First Nation. On the other end, that purple color saying they're in some sort of consideration, they're talking about the idea. When it comes to partnering with neighboring municipalities, over 50% are doing that already. And when it comes to infrastructure, we've seen the same pattern, that 12% are partnering with a neighboring First Nation community, and about 55% are partnering with a neighboring municipality on infrastructure. What's interesting is that most of these communities and First Nations have an incredible overlap in their priorities, whether it's around road servicing, fire department services, whether it is recreation facilities, but there doesn't seem to be that huge amount of desire for collaboration. An exciting example that has come out of our research is a community-owned broadband initiative in Dubreuilville in Northern Ontario, a community of about 600 people that historically had very poor internet connectivity. And they got frustrated with the national telecom communications companies for not coming to provide service. So they said, forget it, we're going to do it ourselves. So there are 4 municipalities, 5 First Nations that have purchased and they own and they now operate the fiber to home network. So they are now providing broadband service to residences, to schools, to hospitals, to police station, to businesses in the region. What was interesting is we were talking about the communities and why they did this. They said it was a great lesson in regional collaboration and regional governance. But one of their other critical components is they actually recognize this as an economic reconciliation tool. So they've been able to integrate the truth and reconciliation process into this around connectivity, because it's not just about getting connectivity, that connectivity also has other implications in terms of health and social service delivery, education, employment opportunities, training opportunities. So a really interesting example that comes out of there. And the last one I'm going to share is around labor forces and newcomer attraction.
And Ryan, I'm going to, excuse me, I just want to give you about approximately 5-minute warning.
That is excellent timing. So on the labor force side of things, we know that rural communities historically have had very low experience with that, not being the first choice of most newcomers that have come to Canada, but we're seeing the tide shifting. Communities are attracting new people into their communities, which is fantastic. It's also meant that we've had to figure out how, not only do we welcome, do we attract newcomers to come in, whether they've been living in downtown Calgary or whether they were living in Shanghai, but also how do we make sure that they have a welcoming experience when they arrive in rural communities. And I was going to share a story with you about an experience of one community. I'll leave them nameless. They were welcoming a large number of newcomers from Mauritius in the South Indian Ocean that arrived in the prairies in February. And the community thought this was an unfortunate arrival time. And so they strived to collect money, they fundraised to buy Canada Goose winter parkas for everybody that was coming into the community, because they were very concerned about how well they would like the dead of winter in the prairies. And this was great, except they gave the coats to all the newcomers, about 40, and they refused to wear them. And the community was offended that they had raised money, expensive coats. And so it took a bit of discussion to find out why people weren't wearing the coats. And people from Mauritius said their first goal was to fit in. They wanted to fit in and integrate into the community. All of the Canada Goose jackets were the same color. So if you wore them, everyone knew that you were new to the community. And the only thing that the newcomers, their first priority was to fit in. You can't fit in if everyone knows who you are with your blue coat or red coat, and when everyone's wearing the same. So they chose not to wear them. It wasn't the community. The community didn't realize that disconnect. So we have work to do around how do we welcome new people into our communities. And I'm going to turn to this notion of moving forward, because as we start to look into the future, as we kind of think about these discussions for today, I've got 6 kind of points here that I would maybe offer from these experiences. The first is that these transitions are not new. We've been entertaining them for a long time. We will continue to entertain them for a long time. So there's things to be learned along the way. We also know that rural has an incredible resilience. We've seen it for 100+ years. But at the same time, we have multiple challenges to it. And particularly if we look to the pandemic, we know that the human, the financial capacities that are there have been drained. They are exhausted. So even though we've got this resilience, we know that we need to nurture that resilience. We also know that government is not the answer for rural communities. Government is not going to be the savior that comes in and saves rural communities. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure we want the government to be the saving factor for communities. I think we have to shift the dynamic to how do we make community-government relationship move beyond this client relationship to partner relationship. And that creates a new dynamic. There's considerable overlap in priorities and potentials around Indigenous and rural communities that are poorly explored at this stage of the game, that we have potential to move forward with. We also know that rural has an incredible amount of wealth if we start to think about it differently, and how do we capitalize that wealth to benefit rural people at the end of the day? And that's a huge challenge that we have to figure out. And the other is we need to find forums, and this is where today is really exciting, because we often don't share lessons of how communities have been trying to do things that people have explored, that have worked well, but also perhaps haven't worked well. We rarely get opportunities to share with others what's happening, exciting things, things that worked and didn't work. Partly we have a culture of kind of, if things don't work, we don't tell people, but incredible resource would be to know that that doesn't work and why, so you don't do it yourself in a different community. So in that spirit, I wanted to share 2 things as I end here. One is an upcoming conference just down the road in Lethbridge with the University of Lethbridge and the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation that will bring together researchers, community members, volunteers, Indigenous nations, and will bring together businesses to talk about these exact topics. The other one is a newsletter that comes out on a monthly basis from the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation that I think you would find interesting, stories from across Canada of new information, new resources. And you can sign up for that for free. It'll just show up in your inbox every day. With that though, I'm gonna maybe pause or end the presentation. My contact information is there. Happy to chat at any point in time. But also, we do have time for some question and answers on that, or curiosities. And so perhaps with that, I'll open it up to if there's any questions, whether it be in the room or online. And we'll maybe take down my presentation so we can see the folks that are online. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Great, thanks very much. So we have a couple of questions that have come in through chat. So we'll start with that and then we'll pass over to Janelle. So one of the first questions was around from Vive. And in fact, I think you're in the room, Vive. Do you want to ask your question?
Online.
Yeah.
Oh, you're on
online, but yeah, I'm just looking for some historical successes, if any, that attempted this what I call reverse migration to rural communities, or even attempted such a migration. Because I heard people say that such movements are anti-capitalism. At least that's how they see this. They don't see this as a way of life. So I'm just curious whether Ryan could elaborate on that. Some historical context.
A great question, and I may be happy to keep chatting about this afterwards, but 2 that come to my mind. One is at the moment Japan, and Japan has actually instituted a policy with financial incentives for families to leave Tokyo and repopulate rural Japanese communities. And there's a tax benefit of doing this. They'll actually pay you to leave the city to start your life in rural communities. And that's been an interesting experience. It's still in its, I think, too early to determine the outcome of that activity, But it's definitely promising because the city of Tokyo can't continue to grow. And so they needed to find other options. So that's one, but that has a real financial motivation to it. The second one that I would pass along is maybe more recent, and that's the influence of COVID-19 and the disruption it had for where people work. And in that vein, we start to see metro adjacent communities, so those within maybe an hour's commuting distance to the urban core, as actually seeing growth. And we can see this through housing prices and house availability in the neighboring communities. And we started to see a huge boom of that taking place. The question is, does that sustain itself as businesses and employers maybe return to the office, whether it's back to where it was pre-pandemic or whether it's a hybrid model? But this has been a fascinating question that we've been looking at because it starts to influence the community vitality of where people are living. If they're still connected to the urban core for employment, is that where they also get recreation, their groceries? What does that mean? Do they contribute to volunteer activities, to the livelihood of that place? But those are two that I would pass along as maybe examples, but happy to chat further about that. There's a few other ones that come to my mind.
Thank you for that. I'll share a comment that came in and then pass it over to Janelle, then Hussein. Not a question, but a comment. I think the ATM idea applies to the whole of Canada towards the world, not just rural to urban within Canada. Thanks for that way to think about things. So thanks for that. Janelle, over to you.
Thanks so much for the interesting lecture today, Ryan. I probably have about 20 promising questions, so I'll narrow it down to one,
Sure.
or maybe two. But I wanted to just connect about something I learned. I live early. I grew up in a rural setting, moved back, and at one of my son's hockey games, I recently became aware of the 15-minute conspiracy theory, and have since realized that it's that it's really taken rural communities by storm. And if you're not familiar with it, it's this idea that the government is intentionally trying to create a system of resources for people living in rural centers that are within a 15-minute drive. And I go like, this sounds wonderful, and some of the things you said in your talk, right, reminded me of this. That's why I brought it up. But people believe that this is a way that the government intends to create districts that people aren't allowed to leave, kind of like the past reserve system, right? And people are really concerned and paranoid about this concept. And so I just was wondering, like you're nodding, so I know you've heard about it. So I'm wondering, I mean, it just seems like it's acting against so many things that many of us in this meeting would be working towards in terms of making sure that people in rural settings don't have to drive an hour, 2 hours for resources, right? And so I'm wondering if you could comment on that, please.
Yeah, it's a big question and something that I think needs a lot more discussion. But in it, I think there are elements around who's making decisions. Right? So there's an issue of scale, who's making decisions and who's impacted by those decisions. And often those that are impacted are not involved in the discussions of the decisions. So there's I think a flaw in the scenario there. I think there's also an interesting discussion around, if we think about rural Canada in general, most of our infrastructure was designed to get things out. It was designed to get timber out of communities on the roads. It was designed to get minerals out. And if we wanted to be really provocative, we might even say it was to get people out eventually as well. So there's a whole series of different interesting layers to this question around, as you discussed in that 15-minute conspiracy, what does that look like? That I don't think have really been discussed. And I think it's long overdue. And part of it is who's making decisions, what are the decisions, what's the motivation for those decisions? Because I think we would soon find that the motivations don't match the priorities of the people that live there. And that's where we get some really big disconnects and a lot of frustration.
No doubt it's an extension of COVID.
Yes.
Conspiracy as well, right? But this idea of control outside of others.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Janelle. Hussein, and then I'll have a question online and then over to Cynthia.
Thank you, Ryan. My question to you on one of your slides, you mentioned rural energy. You mentioned the movement of the rural energy. the last, like, I would say, 10 to 15 years, we have seen those big urban cities, January, big cities, if you have the cost of building the housing and so on. So affordability is very out of the and we have seen a movement of big cities today. Directions in those studies. I mean, it was one direction. But the season, even after people forward, then we know we see a movement. But in our community, when we look at it, within the community, we look at it here, we look at 20 years data, and we didn't see any growth in the population.
So Ryan, oh,
Yeah, so for those that are online that maybe didn't quite hear the full extent of that question, it's a great question around urban to rural migration and rural to urban migrations. And I presented something that's incredibly generalized on the slide, and there are, as you're alluding to saying, multiple nuances to it in terms of when do people move, how do they move, on all of that front. And so we've been looking at it from a couple of perspectives. One is through tax filer data, because one of the really cool things that most people have never really realized is that your tax T4 states your home address and your postal code and the postal code of your employer. So we know right off the bat, are you employed in the same region as where you live? So we've been looking at the tax filer data. It also is a wonderful piece of information because of the 2202As, which is your tuition. So we can determine if mobility is influenced by educational opportunities. But there's a couple of pieces that I would absolutely agree with you on. Everything I agree with you on. The first is the census data is only every 5 years. And so when we start to look at it, it misses the intra-census period migration patterns. And so when we look at the data, if you left Alberta, left Edmonton and moved to Sundre in 2017, lived there for 2 years, returned in 2019, according to the census data, you never left Edmonton, because the census data captures it in 2016 and 2021. So intra-census period movement is lost in the census data, which is predominantly where we turn to think about mobility. The other thing that we've been looking at is trying to break down newcomers and mobility. What does that really mean? Because you might move from one end of town to the other end of town, and usually that's not what we're focused on. But we're looking at, do people, particularly newcomers, international migrants, most of them arrive in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, 85+%. Affectionately, I like to refer to it as MTV. But the question is, do they stay in MTV, or do they have a secondary migration that maybe they leave downtown Vancouver and they move out to a neighboring community? But there's so many nuances to the migration, to the mobility, but it speaks to an issue that as we design policy and programs, we have to be mindful of all of these nuances. Otherwise, we start to have great challenges at the end of the day. So if you are a newcomer welcoming organization in a rural community, and you are a Sundre example, when you apply for a program and it says how many newcomers came to your community during the census, it might be 0, even though you had 25 families come into the center for programs and supports. But in terms of how that program, if it's only using the census data to justify budgets, you would actually get a 0, which is an incredible challenge. And the other challenge is if you're moving multiple times, how does that get captured for school divisions, for public libraries, for hospitals? It has a huge implication, and we've not really got a good system for measuring it.
thanks, Ryan. So for those that are interested, there was a little bit of an exchange in the chat about community creating a community-based endowment fund. So thanks for the question and the responses in there. We're going to go to Cynthia and then Ricardo and then Josie.
Thanks for your presentation.
So I was looking online.
I know. That was really interesting, and you presented a lot of.
Sorry, Cynthia, would you do your best to speak as loudly as you could so we can hear it too?
So I'm just wondering if there are examples of investment developers that specifically work to develop in rural areas. operate successfully there?
Yeah, great question. So the answer, I think, is yes, there are companies that do that, that are focused on rural and northern communities. I think some of the larger ones that are out there they're not solely focused on rural and northern. It's an arm of their business that are doing it and usually responding to market demands. So we think of places that are large natural resource extractions that might be building housing. So that's maybe a category, a very unique category. The other category that I would suggest I can think of examples are developers who are interested in rural places, and that's their bread and butter. And I think they approach it differently from a couple of different perspectives. One is around how do they define affordability and appropriateness of housing, because what is designed for downtown Edmonton looks fundamentally different than in a rural community. And so I think there is an element of appropriateness that is involved for those developers that maybe isn't there or isn't front of center for other communities. I think there's also a greater recognition of the realities of living rural, which are things like distance and density that play into it, that create different designs. And I think if some of the ones that have been more successful, and I think particularly out to Atlantic Canada, they also have an engagement mechanism with the home community that they're developing in, and beyond just simply a legislated engagement, but actually having discussions with communities around what housing stock is needed, for who, and how to maybe facilitate that, particularly in connection to environmental plans or communities' desire for other developments in the future. So I think the big difference I would see is the engagement and the appropriateness of the development. Yeah, I think, does that answer your question? And I'll pull up a few names of companies specifically
That would be great.
that I can pass along. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Ricardo wanted to make a comment about funding, and if you have a question, Ricardo, you can add that as well. Do you want to unmute and join? Okay, thanks. Ricardo was just making a comment. That's fine. And so for those that didn't see it, it was talking about the disparity in that he believes there's a disparity in funding, and the transition to project to process funding is such a disadvantage to rural development in terms of the social capital, economic growth, and long-term investment of rural attraction for newcomers. So thank you for that. Josie, would you like to share your question?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to make a comment about that truth and reconciliation and broadband. I think that we should just talk about equity and name it, instead of disguising it as truth and reconciliation, because essentially the principle of equity should be applicable everywhere, because every person counts. The second point and question that I have is the comment or the findings on rural communities willing to partner with Indigenous communities. And I'm wondering if you've been able to dig deeper to find out why.
Yeah.
And I'm also wondering how much the Indian Act, the First Nations Land Management Act has to do with that.
So you hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
Absolutely. So to answer the second question, I think we did go deeper into just simply partner, not partner. The barriers that we heard from folks were maybe threefold. One is they both are operating in what they call different worlds. The Indigenous communities had to go through Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, and communities had to go through a municipal, provincially regulated government for programs. So even when communities came together to do a joint water project, they have to go through two separate funding processes to actually make it happen. And neither of them move very quickly, and they never coordinate. So there's always a disconnect between kind of funding mechanisms and the program opportunities that always serve as a hindrance right from the get-go. The second comment that people passed along to us was one around relationships, and the relationships that had been between communities and Indigenous communities had disappeared or had changed as succession had taken place in elected leadership roles. And so there hadn't been mechanisms to have forums for discussion in a way that people were feeling comfortable with. They were, municipalities often go to a municipalities conference, First Nations are going to other forums for their discussions, but they're not often interacting. And the third piece that we heard from folks was that both Indigenous and rural communities sometimes just have different priorities at different times, and it just doesn't make sense to collaborate. Whereas one community might be focused on housing issues, the other might be focused on exploring and encouraging new immigration, migration, or new businesses. And so it's just an alignment of priorities as opposed to we don't want to work with folks. Yeah, those were the three big ones that people shared with us.
Thanks for that. There's a call to take a little bit of a look here at the question about community-based endowment funds and what resources are available to create a town-based fund to invest in local economic development. How would we do it?
Yeah, so there's lots of potential opportunities and ways you can do it. The first I would suggest is take a look at what's in one's community already. There might already be vehicles that are there that you just are not aware of, whether they're active or maybe they've been less active over the last few years. But first off, just do a scan around your community, see if there is a vehicle of that nature already in existence. There are 18,000 of them across the country. You might be home to one or maybe even 7 of them in your community. If there's not, or there are vehicles, but they do different things and aren't aligned to what you're thinking about, there are a few organizations out there nationally that you might think about. One is Community Foundations of Canada. They are a national network that provide resources for communities that might be interested in starting, whether it's their own individual charity to do this, or to partner with an existing charity where they create a specific envelope of funding for just a community or a smaller region. And so those are resources that are out there. But the other is, if you know of other groups that are doing something similar, give them a call. They're always happy to share their story of how they got started, how they've been doing it, and I'm sure they'll be willing to share resources along the way as well. So don't reinvent the wheel is my big message on that front. There are groups out there that have resources, and we can stick a few of their websites into the chat box here.
That would be great. All right, and I think we have time for maybe one more question. Maybe 2, we'll see how fast we go. Douglas, over to you.
Thank you. One of the things that we found in talking to different rural communities across Alberta is that they have a great deal of trouble attracting any kind of developer to come and work in their community, no matter what they do. However, this may be a blessing in disguise, because what I've seen in particularly where I live, Lake Country is a very small little community between Kelowna and Vernon. The development that's coming in there is actually very, very bad for the community, and is sucking all sorts of municipal resources out and creating all kinds of interesting problems. So development, as it's traditionally done in Canada, may not be the best solution. Instead, what we found to have been alerted to is the ideas like things that are called opportunity development cooperatives. And so cooperatives they really haven't caught on in Canada, but they have an incredible amount of value. And so these economic development cooperatives, I'm just reading from one of the websites, it's a for-profit approach. So they approach or are approached by local entrepreneurs with a business opportunity in need of investment. So it's local investment, but it's done in a cooperative way. This may be a much better model for us moving forward than the standard development one.
Yeah, and there's examples of that across Canada. I can think of a few in Nova Scotia, where they've used a co-op model to facilitate those developments. But you're right, it's not something that's wide scale. Co-ops have been around in Canada since over 100 years, and we've got a wealth of experience on that. There's a couple of groups that people might take a look at. One is called Cooperatives First. They're based in Saskatoon, but they provide support services, extension services across Western Canada to communities that are looking at these sorts of topics. And I'm sure they'd be happy to pass along resources and insights that they've gathered along the way. And the other group slipped my mind completely.
We have Dan Oler from the Alberta Communities
Oh, yes.
Cooperatives Association online here, and he put his email in there, so.
Perfect.
Yes.
So yes, I think it's a great model, and there's huge potential for it. It's been underutilized.
Amazing. So, so many good other topics coming up here around community land trusts and supporting young farmers to get started, talking about immigration. There's clearly lots more for us to discuss, and we're at time. So I just put into the chat Ryan's email address. Also, we put in a couple times the resources that he shared. I'll actually just drop it in one more time into the chat here. So please, let's continue this conversation. Ryan's offered to stay in touch. And before we take a break for those that are part of the workshop, I'd like to pass over to Lorelei to close us off.
Thanks, Susanna. So I just wanted to thank Ryan very much for his presentation, and I think that you've given lots of people lots to think about and some excellent ideas for kind of what they can do next in their communities. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the invitation.